Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock, episode 229. This week the questions are taken from guides 270 and 271, that's on USS Saipan and the Russian ship Varyag, along with the accompanying Wednesday videos on Chatham Dockyard and naval engineering disasters, with a question or two thrown in from a Friday video that came out during that time, which was on Dystopian Wars, the game. So let's begin. Christopher Babylon asks, as the Saipans were originally made as escort carriers, would they have worked well as pure fighter carriers, and would they have survived kamikazes if they were hit with the armour that they have? In terms of the kamikaze hits, well, they are the best protected escort-light fleet carriers that the US built outside of, obviously, the main fleet carriers themselves. They've got better armour protection than an Independence class, for example, when it comes to resisting kamikaze impacts, and they're obviously, both the Independences and the Saipans are considerably better off than standard escort carriers, which tend to have minimal armour, if any. But, on the other hand, whilst their armour is closer to that found on an Essex class than any of their smaller contemporaries, it still isn't quite at the same level as an Essex class, and well, we know from Bunker Hill and Franklin and a few others that it was still entirely possible to really badly mess up an Essex class when the kamikazes got a decent hit in, or in the case of one of them, a decent set of bomb hits in. So would they survive kamikaze hits? Maybe. They've certainly got a decent fighting chance, but their protection isn't extensive enough that the right kamikaze hit in the right place wouldn't destroy them. But it's, as I said, less likely than if a standard escort carrier got hit. Now, would they have worked well as a pure fighter carrier? Yes. Obviously, with their introduction into service, you're looking at primarily post-war operations. And, well, if you look at the all-up weights and the takeoff weights and sizes of various US Navy attack aircraft versus the fighter aircraft, with the exception of the A4 Skyhawk, the attack aircraft are considerably larger and considerably heavier. So operating the Saipans as a pure fighter carrier would probably be the only way that they could continue to see service in the post-war environment. Although, again, even taking that into account, the Essex class, which are obviously considerably bigger and more capable than them, were very rapidly pushed out of operating most of the latter to or mid to late Cold War infantry, because even they weren't big enough. So a pure fighter Saipan in the 50s and 60s, I guess, again, a bit beyond the channel's scope, but approximately based on weights and sizes, I would say maybe would make a certain amount of sense. Maybe you could even get a Skyhawk operating off of them. But with their size, the Saipans that is, I suspect that the fighter carrier would be the only way to go, because they'd be limited to a very small number of aircraft. At which point I would probably use them perhaps less as fighter carriers per se, but more as mobile, self-defending resupply vessels for the bigger carriers. So perhaps they would have a small contingent, maybe 4, 6, 8, something like that, attached fighters who would defend the ship if worst came to worst, but whatever space was left over would just be devoted to close packing a bunch of fighters, or if it got late enough, maybe Skyhawks again, if they can operate from it, I don't know, and having that sail with the rest of the fleet on Korean or Vietnam War operations. And then if the larger carriers start to suffer casualties to their air group, then you can break out a few spare pilots and a few spare airframes from a Saipan and do a quick hop over to the fleet carrier to bring them back up to strength. But the size and capabilities of jet aircraft are very rapidly outpaced an awful lot of World War II era vessels. Ray Sia asks, I want to know more about these military communication ships. I'd never considered such a thing because we've always had satellite communications during my lifetime. So military communication ships had a number of roles. I mean, technically, to a certain extent, you could argue they possibly still do have today, because although, as you mentioned, we rely an awful lot on satellite comms, etc., well, let's just say if you were in a situation where it was a full-on war and some of the world's biggest navies were going at it, you may not have access to satellite comms anymore for various reasons. But nonetheless, scooting back more towards the time of the Channel, the communications ships, as I said, essentially have two major roles. There's a lot of other roles that they do serve, but these are the two biggest ones. One is that older ships may not have a huge amount of communications equipment themselves. So even when you had early satellite communications, or even if in theory a ship could be within range of at least longer distance radio communications ashore, they may not have the facilities to be upgraded to that level of communications technology, or the stuff that they do have might have a fairly low throughput. Whereas shorter range communications, which can send a lot more information, they might have a lot more access to and might be easier to refit onto the ship, but obviously don't reach a huge distance. And you've also got to account that you've got encryption, decryption, signals processing, etc. Again, limited space on a lot of older ships, might not be able to do that. Whereas a communication ship can do all of those things. So someone can send, by whatever means, a message to a communication ship that's intended for a ship in the fleet that it's attached to, and then both the reception of that message or the transmission of messages from that vessel through to the mainland can all be handled by the much greater capabilities of the military communication ship. So those vessels can obviously encode and decode things faster and transmit them much more clearly. And then they can relay those messages back and forth, again, via the shortwave systems or short-range systems to the affected ships in question. So that's item one. And item two, which depends to a certain degree on the time period, is simply that some areas of the ocean are just flat out outside of communications range. Back in World War II, that would have been, what was the longest range radio transmitter that you could get your hands on. That could reliably transmit a decent amount of information with encryption, clearly enough to be actually properly received and decoded in pretty much all weather conditions. Because this is the thing, it's no good having a long-range radio system that just about reaches to, say, Third Fleet, and maybe it's based in Australia or on Guadalcanal or something. But if that communications can just about reach, unless there's a storm or particularly unusual weather activity, or the fleet sails into an area where electromagnetic interference from the high atmosphere is particularly enhanced, which was a case for a good chunk of the southwestern Pacific, then all of a sudden it doesn't work. Well, that's not really helpful. So communication ships effectively act like relay and booster points back in those days. So if the reliable range of your onshore radio is, let's say, arbitrarily 1,000 miles, so you could station a communication ship 800, 900 miles away from shore, so they're comfortably inside the reliable communications range, and then they can boost that forward. So let's say your fleet is 2,500 miles away, a signal might pass through 2 or 3 communication ships acting as relays, and that means that when that communication finally gets to the fleet, it's coming through with the same level of clarity and power as it would if that fleet was hovering just offshore of the actual mainland that's made that transmission. Obviously, that applies more to the slightly older school, which is more the time period the Channel covers, but even during that time period, you've also got the sort of acting as a clearinghouse and relay point just generally to make up for most other ships not having a huge amount of comms equipment. And of course, that's going to vary ship by ship. So, an Essex class or an Iowa class, for example, will have a fairly comprehensive communication suite aboard and can probably handle most of their own transmissions. But if the captain of a destroyer escort wants to talk to home in 1944 or 1945, or a frigate captain wants to talk to home, from the coast of Vietnam in, I guess, the Cold War, the chances of them being able to either physically make that transmission, or if they can put a huge amount of data into those transmissions, is going to be relatively slim compared to the big carriers and so forth. And that's where the comm ship comes in. Less Common Knowledge asks, do you think that the Romans or the Greeks or the Carthaginians had the technological capabilities, or could have developed the technology within a few hundred years, to build a ship with the size and seagoing capability of the late 18th century ships of the line, like Victory, obviously minus cannon, before the beginning of the first millennium AD? Size-wise, it is entirely possible. So we know of the existence of several ships that approximate the size of HMS Victory, at least in terms of length. So in the ballpark, you have things like the Syracusia, which is somewhat probably fancifully rendered here. You've obviously got the Nemi ships on Lake Nemi in Italy, albeit they're not seagoing. And I believe there's some question as to if they really do all that much other than slowly pottering around the lake. You've also got the Leontophoros, I think that's how you pronounce it, or Leontophoros, which would be actually slightly longer than Victory, depending on which size calculations you believe in, and would just resemble a gigantic war galley. And then you have the ever argued about Tessara Conteres, I think that's how it's pronounced, or Tessa Conteres, one of the ways. Anyway, which again would be considerably larger than HMS Victory. The one thing that, however, connects pretty much all of those ships is that they are generally reputed to have been absolute pigs to try and get moving, and to, once they were moving, change direction in any meaningful way, shape or form. And none of them seem to have particularly long careers, except for the Leontophoros, which actually did have a somewhat active war career, albeit even she wasn't repeated. So could they develop something the size of Victory? Yes, they did. Seagoing capabilities of Victory, the main thing that's probably going to hold them back is that, as far as I'm aware, they're all going to be clinker-built vessels, which is, at this scale, something of a downside. You really want a carvel-framed vessel to get up to the size of something like Victory. So, you could pull off something like Syracusia, or a very slightly larger version of Syracusia, which would be of the same kind of size and scale of Victory, and possibly even, in terms of seaworthiness, possibly even be approximately as seaworthy as Victory. But she's going to be a lot slower, a lot heavier, and a lot more difficult to handle in most respects than a first-rate ship of the line. So could they have then advanced that technology forward to the point where they could basically come up with a cannonless Victory-style vessel in terms of capabilities? Maybe. It's possible, but they'd have to make the breakthrough to frame and carvel planking considerably earlier than appears to be historical. Bounty Flamore asks, do you think the biggest ships in Zheng He's treasure fleet ever really existed the way their size is described, given that even in the 1800s, wooden metal reinforced ships of smaller size had trouble not breaking on the open ocean? I think they definitely did exist. Whether their size is what some people interpret it to be is another matter entirely, because we know what the dimensions of Zheng He's ships were. They're written down, but they're written down in a Chinese traditional unit of measurement, and as with a lot of ancient traditional units of measurement, what the standardized version is that we have today is not necessarily reflective of what the unit was at the time that the ship was being built. And that's not necessarily even a case of, up for the last, let's say, 500 years it was this long, and 500 years before that it was this long, and so on and so forth. Standardization is, relatively speaking, a recent innovation. So you would have a case of, here's our standard unit of measurement, whether you want to call it a foot, a yard, or in the Chinese case, I believe it's a zhang. And over in one part of the country, it might be one length, and over in another country, another part of the country, it might be a slightly different length. So if you look at, say, another ancient ship whose dimensions regularly get argued about in certain corners of the internet, Noah's Ark, which, again, we know its dimensions. They're described in cubits, but outliers accepted, the cubits of that time period, depending on which culture and civilization you're looking at, range with, the smallest cubit and the largest cubit. There might be a 20% difference between them. So you take the smallest regular cubit you find from ancient times and the largest regular cubit, as opposed to some of the really exceptionally large ones that you find in ancient times, and the larger one is 20% longer. So which one do you use? And that's before you get into royal cubits and all that kind of stuff. So with that borne in mind, if a Chinese account says, well, this ship was so many zang long and so many zang wide, it's 99% likely that is exactly how long and wide they were. It's just we don't know exactly how long a zang was at that point. Personally, for me, the most believable estimates that I've seen that conform to what we reasonably know about the reality of Chinese shipbuilding and the capabilities of the materials they were making things from, but also aren't completely lowballing it for various reasons, which I have seen some authors do. I would personally reckon that the kind of dimensions you're probably looking at for something like Zheng He's fleet's largest vessels is probably in the order of maybe 260, 270 foot, maybe as high as 300 foot, which would make them a bit larger than something like HMS Victory. So they'd be pushing up to some of the larger first-rate ships of the line, possibly even bigger than most of them of the Napoleonic Wars period. And as you can see by this replica, which is just a fraction smaller than that suggested dimension, they would probably have a considerably larger amount of internal volume because A, they're not carrying massive numbers of cannon, and B, Chinese effectively ship design at this point goes for, as you can see from the bow, a slightly more box-like structure. So they're pretty hefty ships, and quite impressive, especially for their time period. But if you apply the modern Zhang measurement to the ancient descriptions of Zheng He's fleet, well, then you end up with ships that are just so absurdly large, as you mentioned, that they're 99% certain are probably not going to hold themselves together. Galactic Emperor asks, are shells interchangeable? For example, could Rodney and Iowa fire each other's main battery shells? Technically, yes. Practically not really, and it's a much narrower field even within that than you might otherwise think, because we tend, at least in the UK and the US, at least, to describe weapons by their caliber in inches. So in Rodney and Iowa's case, 16-inch guns. However, you do have to bear in mind that whilst people generally aimed for approximate parity in gun power, that doesn't mean they were all using exactly the same systems. So, for example, you see the Bismarcks often described as being armed with 15-inch guns, because near enough as makes no difference, they are armed with 15-inch guns. However, they aren't actually armed such, because the 15 inches is 381, 382 millimeters, whereas the German quote-unquote 15-inch gun is a 380 millimeter gun, because of course they're using metric, which is actually 14.96 centimeters. So a 15-inch German shell and a 15-inch British shell would not be comparable. And the same thing with the French. They have 380 mils. So a French 380 millimeter shell and a German 380 millimeter shell might be technically interchangeable, but not with a British or a 15-inch gun. Now, when it comes to why I say technically, theoretically, yes, but practically no, the next problem you have is that the shells are designed to operate at certain working pressures from the propellant behind them, with certain propellants that burn at different temperatures. The rifling in the barrels has a certain set to it, whether it's 1 in 50, 1 in 60, 1 in 65, 1 in 70, etc. Now, because we're talking World War II and most shells are using driving bands, again, technically speaking, two shells of exactly the same caliber, the driving bands would engage, but again, they would impart completely different rates of spin, and the shells are different weights. So it would lead to all sorts of interesting problems. You might just about manage to get a shell out of the barrel, and this is completely ignoring the fact that, for example, a very large, long, heavy 16-inch shell such as the US Mark 8 Super Heavy is exceptionally unlikely to fit in anyone else's shell hoists. All of that aside, literally if we've just craned the shell into the turret itself and we're going through the loading sequence, between the propellant differences, because you are going to be using the ships, whichever ship you're flying, you are going to be using their propellant, because what happens if you just loosely stuff or compact down somebody else's powder or whatever they're using for charge into a completely different sized breech and then set it off? You do not want to be there when that happens. But, assuming that aside, if, say, you stuck Rodney's 16-inch shell into an Iowa class 16-inch 50 gun and then stuffed the charge for a Mark 8 shell behind it, I suspect that shell might well disintegrate, either in the process of going up the barrel or shortly thereafter. It might not, but even if it doesn't, it's going to go completely in a random direction. Your area of impact is going to be somewhere over in that direction. And likewise with a American shell put into Rodney's guns and fired with British charges, assuming that the shell doesn't have any major structural issues on its way out, then again, who knows where it's going to land, because it's the rifling isn't going to be calibrated for its weight, the charge isn't going to have been calibrated for its weight, nothing is going to. The only thing you would succeed in doing is, yes, it will go out of the gun, assuming that neither shell disintegrates because of the difference in working pressure and temperature of the propellants, but you're not going to have any clue where it's going to go. And it's very likely that the next shell you fire is probably going to go in a completely different place. Ian McSherry asks, at about 15 minutes into the video on Chatham, is that HMS Tiger perchance? It looks quite like her. I had the pleasure of wandering around her as a boy in the 70s when she made port call in Leith. She seemed huge at the time. First time I'd encountered a Sea King helicopter up close too in the hangar. Quite a day out for a young lad back then. Very close, but the hull pennant number C99 here indicates that it's HMS Blake, which, all else aside, you could be very easily forgiven for thinking this is Tiger, which was C20, because, well, one, they're sister ships, and two, Tiger and Blake were the two ships that were converted to have the big helicopter hangar on their back as well. So, yeah, it's very, very, very similar, but it is in fact Blake Tiger's sister ship. But that's not to say that Tiger wasn't also at Chatham. She was. It just so happens that this particular picture is, of course, as I said, of Blake with all her flags, etc. out. Lasse Eglerson, I think. I apologise if that's a horrific pronunciation of your name. Asks two questions about the Lexington class battlecruisers. They were supposed to have a displacement that would have been about 3,000 tons-ish less than Hood, whilst having almost the same beam and length, but the Lexington's armour would only have been a fraction of what Hood had. So why is their weight almost the same? Is it because the extra machinery necessary for the Americans to get the ship up to their desired, at least initial, target speed of 35 knots, or because of the extra weight caused by the presence of the 16-inch guns? And two, related to that, the Lexington class would have had about 180,000 shaft horsepower, which is about 36,000 more than Hood, but it would only have been able to go 1 knot faster in the end, compared to what Hood was able to accomplish in 1920. Why is this? Is it because water resistance at this speed is so high that you need 36,000 shaft horsepower more just to get that extra 1 knot? Or did Hood have a more efficient hull shape? Well, for one thing, you'd be surprised what you can do with 3,000 tons in terms of armour protection. Yes, armour overall on a ship this size will take up even more weight than that, but that is a huge amount of additional weight you could use. So, partly, the fact that Lexington's design displacement is a little bit less than Hood's would, amongst other things, have an impact on how much armour she could carry, depending obviously on what the checks and balances were and what had been sacrificed and what hadn't been sacrificed on the two designs. Of course, having the 16-inch guns would also have caused some additional weight to be taken up on Lexington that then couldn't be used for things like armour, as compared to 15-inch guns on Hood, because 16-inch 50 caliber gun is considerably larger and somewhat heavier than a 15-inch 42. And also, Lexington was designed to use turbo-electric machinery. Now, whilst turbo-electric machinery at the time does have some advantages, one of the big disadvantages is that it weighs more and takes up more space than an equivalent geared turbine plant. So that means that Lexington overall is carrying slightly heavier armament and considerably heavier machinery than Hood, and therefore, if the firepower and the speed, i.e. the machinery, is heavier and you've got less weight, then armour protection is going to be the thing that gets sacrificed. Now, as for power, apart from hull form, which there will be some differences, if for no other reason than the British have considerable experience of high displacement, high speed hulls, having, built the Invincibles, the Indefatigables, the Lions, Tiger, Renown and Repulse, and then obviously now Hood. So they've got a little bit more embedded experience with building this kind of hull. So it's highly likely that Hood's hull design probably would have been slightly more efficient than Lexington's. We know the G3s made use of an awful lot of advanced hydrodynamics in their design, because you look at their calculated power output versus their projected speed, there's no way that's happening without some very interesting things going on with the hull form. But that in and of itself isn't going to be enough to explain the power difference. The other aspect is going to be a good chunk of that power is going to be needed just to hit that additional top speed, because you look at the Iowas when they're originally launched are not that far above the Lexingtons in terms of displacement, and they need well over 200,000 shaft horsepower. No, it's 212,000 to be more precise, in order to reach essentially the same target speed, 33 knots. And when you look at the Lexingtons when they're carriers, they've dropped a bunch of weight and their power plants reach just a fraction over 200,000 shaft horsepower on sea trials. But compared to the target speed of just over 33 knots in their slightly heavier battlecruiser configuration, even that additional 22,000 shaft horsepower, as I said, with considerable lightening, only buys them a not enough bit of additional speed. Andrew Goz asks, this may be a bit redundant, but listening to this is the ship design one. With a K-class, did no one at any point stop to question whether designing a submarine whose crush depth was less than the length of the submarine itself might have been a poor design choice? What was the rationale for the dive depth being so shallow? Well, it's a little bit of sort of, if you like, six of one, half dozen of the other. The test depth itself being 200 feet wasn't awful for a World War I design. There were quite a number of submarines on both sides who had test depths that were actually less than that. Now, granted, there were a few that had test depths that were a bit more than that. The handful of large German U-boats that approximate the Ks in terms of their overall displacement generally had another 50 to 100 foot in terms of test depth over the Ks. But a good chunk of the German submarine fleet that was used in World War I also had a test depth that was considerably less. So, having a 200-foot test depth, it's not the worst. It's actually relatively decent, but it could have been better. Obviously, the German U-boats were able to pull off something slightly better with some of their later designs. But the bigger problem was more just the sheer size of the K-class, because a submarine could have a 200-foot test depth, but if the submarine is 110, 120, 150 foot long, then you could somehow upend the thing and not have you have the thing crush while one end is on the surface. Whereas with the Ks, they were so ridiculously long that you wouldn't even necessarily need to upend the ship. The ship could actually have its bow reach test depth whilst the stern was on the surface, and the whole sub was just somewhat angled, which isn't brilliant, to say the least. But the larger problem with this combination is the fact that the Ks were so hideously difficult to manage in terms of, well, anything to do with manoeuvring. Because if a submarine settled relatively evenly and was relatively easy to control with the diving planes or hydroplanes, depending on what you want to call them, then a test depth that is either at or a little bit above, or possibly in some cases even a little bit below the overall length of the sub, is manageable. Obviously, test depths would grow considerably larger in the interwar period and up to World War II. But with the Ks, it was entirely possible that you might aim for a spot halfway between surface level and test depth, and you could end up anywhere along that measurement or beyond test depth if you were particularly unlucky. So, yeah, I think it's not an awful design choice. On paper, it is, and in practice, it is. As a rule of thumb, I personally think if you're going to design a submarine, its test depth should be a little bit deeper than its overall length. But given the limitations of World War One, the bigger problem, I think, is the lack of controllability, which would mean it's much, much more likely you're going to end up in that situation. As I said, design a 120-foot, 140-foot long sub with a 200-foot test depth and good handling, and you're perfectly fine. Design the K-class, and it becomes a much, much, much larger issue. I mean, to be honest, with the K-class as a whole, they probably should have stopped to question a lot of their design decisions much earlier than that, for a whole host of reasons. And ultimately, if you are going to put the amount of resources and effort that you are going to end up putting into something like the K-class, then settling for decent enough for World War I test depth really isn't good enough. You should have gone for, top of class, as much as you possibly could. Albeit that when I finally get around to doing a full video on the K-class, then obviously we'll go into this in a lot more detail, which should be fun. But, as some people have pointed out with the Battle of Texel video, where they get very up in arms about the fact that the K-class managed to accomplish anything. The simple fact of the matter is that the K-class, as with a number of other submarine classes, the design concept behind them, at least conceptually, is not a bad one. And in theory, they do have a kind of a 5-minute window when they are actually relatively useful. The problem is that window closes almost immediately after they enter service. So, late World War One, they theoretically have some kind of place and use, at least as far as test indications would go. But by the early 1920s, that's gone out the window completely. Scott Mason asks, would wood from the West Australian Jarrah tree have made good timbers for wooden warships? It's a very heavy hardwood that's very hard to burn, as I found out. Yes, actually, Jarrah wood, I'm going to be using that word a lot, would make a pretty decent ship timber, all things considered. So if you look at English oak, which is, for obvious reasons, used quite often in Royal Navy warships of the period, and then you look at live oak, famously used relatively extensively in the US heavy frigates like USS Constitution, and then you look at Jarrah wood. Jarrah wood actually sits almost exactly between live oak and English oak in terms of its dried weight or density, which is pretty good. So your ship would displace slightly less if you made a equivalent. So if you made USS Constitution out of English oak, live oak, and Jarrah, then the Jarrah ship would displace less than the historical Constitution, but more than an English oak equivalent of Constitution. Hardness-wise, again, it sits pretty much dead centre between English and live oak, so it's going to be fairly resistant to gunfire, although, as I've covered several times on the Drydock, it's not going to be impregnable to gunfire, but it maybe will have a bit more resistance to long-range shots and shrapnel and so forth. In terms of its elasticity, so its ability to bend, it actually is slightly tougher than both English oak and live oak, which would make it a very rigid, very strong ship, which is quite good. And in terms of overall compression strength, again, it's actually the strongest of the three woods. So a Jarrah wood boat would actually be quite a capable ship. It would be very rigid, very strong, so it's fairly resistant. It would be a little bit weightier than an equivalent boat made out of English oak, but not as much as one made out of live oak or white oak, and we know that obviously you can make a pretty decent ship with the latter. It's very resistant to rot, which is obviously very good if you're in a ship that's going to be out at sea for months and months and months. So yeah, overall it would be a pretty decent wood to make a ship out of if you happen to be building large numbers of Age of Sail ships of the line in Australia. The only caveat to all of that is that apparently Jarrah wood has a horrific tendency to blunt tools that are used to cut it. So you could build a ship. The workers in the shipyards are not going to thank you for it. The Hand of the King asks, Drac, about tabletop games, how do you personally rate different games and systems? What are your top 5 or top 10? Battlefleet Gothic, X-Wing, Dystopian Wars, etc. I find it difficult to compare game systems, to be perfectly honest, because a lot of them undergo a significant amount of development and change as they go on. Either they have a single rule set that then gets significantly refined, or they might have multiple versions. 40k obviously is notorious for its different editions, but even something like Dystopian Wars had at least 2 full sets of rules before Spartan Games went under, and technically kind of a version 2.5 and version 3.0 is in the works. And then now under the new ownership, there's a completely new set of rules, and that in itself is being modified. So unfortunately, it's a bit of a moving target. For example, when X-Wing came out originally, that rule set I actually quite liked. It was fairly simple, fairly easy to understand, but there was a decent amount of nuance to it. So, it wasn't entirely predictable what you were going to do next. Whereas over time, it got more and more complex as more and more updates came out. The Dystopian Wars Spartan Games edition rule set, the basic stuff, movement, shooting, etc., I found very easy to follow, but over time more and more special rules started to come in, to the point that when I was doing little demo matches at various steampunk events over the years, I actually kind of cut out a good chunk of the more specialised rules in exchange for a kind of a streamlined, simplified version, which was much, much easier to teach people. Although the fact that you could, whilst sticking to the primary rules, create a simplified, streamlined version was actually a pretty good mark in its favour. I really like the Battlefleet Gothic rules. For those of you who played it, you'll remember what those were like. I thought they were pretty well designed, and of course a lot of that has gone over into Dropfleet Commander. Well, unsurprisingly, the same game designers. But the one thing that I really was annoyed me when it came to Battlefleet Gothic was that in the updated rules that they published back when Games Workshop was still supporting it, they changed the Nova Cannon from guess range to place your blast marker and scattered is it D6 or 2D6? I can't remember exactly. But the reason I found that annoying was because I was really, really good at guessing the range, which I think is why they changed the rule, because it made your Nova Cannon was and it was a pretty powerful weapon for those of you who never played Battlefleet Gothic, in terms of World War II naval context. A Nova Cannon is kind of like the Spaceborne version of what if they'd put the Dora 80cm gun on a ship as a spinal mount. And when that is, the effectiveness of that weapon is subjective to the individual player's capability to measure distances in their head, it becomes either hilariously useless or hilariously broken. So maybe they had to change it for fairness, but meh. And then, of course, you got Victory at Sea and, as you can see here, Black Seas. So, yeah, I would say it's not very easy for me to give you a top 5 or top 10 game systems in terms of, fun to play, easy to play, understandable rules. I could probably construct a top 5 kind of snapshots. Like, this game at this point in its rule development would be my number X or whatever. But beyond that, it'd be really hard. Josh Thomas Moore asks, which Dystopian Wars model is HMS Warspite captained by Lord Drac? From the new range, they've only released one heavy battleship, the Britannia class, and of course the big aircraft carrier, which you would have seen in the Dystopian Wars video. They are supposed to be releasing a big flagship battleship at some point in the future called the Gloriana class, and yes, 40k fans will notice a similarity of naming there. So until that comes about, the Warspite for me in Dystopian Wars will continue to be the mighty Majestic class dreadnought from the old Spartan Games configuration, which you can see here prior to the installation of its 6 turrets. Matt Blom asks, there was a crash program to get Jean Barr's propulsion system fully functional between May 1940 and mid-June 1940 so that she could escape encroaching German forces, which seems like an engineering miracle to get all that work done in just 4 to 6 weeks' time. Do you know of any other cases in the time covered by the channel where an emergency program either permitted a capital warship to escape opposing forces under fire in a similar manner, or else be completed to defend itself against an impending attack? Not as such, but then the period when you're talking about capital warships, which basically kind of ironclad onwards, doesn't have too many cases where a major shipyard is overrun by your enemies. Now, there are a few cases, for example, in the American Civil War, where shipyards are being overrun and a partially completed craft is either towed out or manages to limp it out on its own, sometimes under fire, sometimes not, or is used as a last bastion to defend against the incoming attackers. However, even though the Monitors were relatively powerful coastal warships for their day, I don't think you can really describe them as capital ships. And when you look at, well, obviously France, 1940, that you've got Jean Barr, which is the example. By the time the Allies are rolling through Germany, well, the Germans aren't really building any new ships, new capital warships at least. The same thing with the Japanese. Obviously, the home islands aren't actually occupied until after the surrender, except there's no ships building at Port Arthur when the Japanese go after them. So examples are relatively few and far between. And when you go further back to wooden warships, then usually if a ship is partly complete, it usually just gets burned on the stocks, because the process of rigging and arming a wooden warship, I mean, you can do it in a few weeks in a pinch, but if you are going to do it, then the ship's either going to leave or it's not. There's not really a lot of kind of half-bakedness going on at that point. So a partially completed ship, as I said, would usually just be fired on the stocks, or a ship that they couldn't get enough crew for to re-equip quickly enough, like some of the US wooden warships when the Confederacy was making their early advances, would be burned in dock. Now, if you extend that to warships that are being refitted, i.e. they've already been completed but they're in port for refit, repair, etc. because of damage or wearing out, there are a few examples of those being able to make it out under fire or defend themselves when otherwise they wouldn't have been released. However, that is slightly different because unless they were completely and utterly crippled, they were always capable of moving, just not necessarily at a particularly ideal rate, as compared to a ship that theoretically is incomplete when a few weeks before the situation comes up. Edward Hopkins asks, how much additional power was gained by adding oil to coal? It's a little difficult to calculate on a broad basis, because when it comes to mixed firing, some ships went with, well, these boilers will burn coal, and these other boilers will burn oil. And then other ships obviously went for the slightly more common, well, here is a coal-fired boiler onto which we will spray oil as well. But then how much oil relative to how much coal the ship carried, and how much was sprayed onto the coal at a given temperature or for a given amount of power, again, would vary from ship to ship. So, it's not possible to give a general answer in terms of precise shaft horsepower, because if a ship, let's say even to make it, arbitrarily slightly easier, let's say a ship is using exactly the same boilers as another class of ship, and they both have oil spraying functionality, and both ships are designed to go at, let's say, 21 knots. Now, if you could have a situation where the one ship, maybe, again using completely arbitrary figures, maybe will burn 2 tons of coal, it'll have 2 tons of coal in the boiler at any given time, and onto that they might spray 50 litres of oil. Again, these are completely arbitrary figures. But the other ship might burn, instead of 2 tons of coal, might burn 1.5 tons of coal, but might put 100 litres of oil in for a given amount of power output. And so, obviously, the power boost that the latter ship that's using more oil is going to get is going to be greater than the power boost that the ship that's using less oil is going to get, even though everything else, their boiler systems, their design speed, etc., is theoretically the same. Now, factor in that people use different kinds of boilers, and there are different classes of ships designed for different kinds of speeds, or the same speed at different power outputs, and it's basically impossible to quantify in very, very broad terms, except to say that compared to the best coal that was available in World War I, oil has a thermal capacity, i.e. delivers energy, that is about 30 to 40% greater than the best coal. So if you are the British running on hand-picked coal, then in theory, for a given mass that is burned, you should get 30 to 40% additional power for the proportion of mass that oil is making up. So if we, again, using somewhat arbitrary figures, if you were going to burn, let's say, 2 tons of coal and 1 ton of oil versus a ship that was going to burn 3 tons of coal instead, so you're both burning 3 tons, then the ship that's using the oil, assuming you're using the best coal, would get, approximately speaking, a 10% overall power boost for doing so. Now, if you're using worse coal, like, say, the Germans, then your power boost relative to just using pure coal might be higher. But again, this is a very artificially constrained scenario where you're burning exactly the same amount of mass, which again is not true. But hopefully that gives some vague indication of what you can expect. Plus, of course, the fact that on some ships, they shovel just as much coal as they would before. They just spray oil in addition to it. The advantages of oil spraying go a lot further than just gaining a bit more power. There's all sorts of other things which we can discuss another time. Ash the Lego guy asks, were folding masts on central battery or turret ironclads ever considered to act as backup power without encumbering the firing arcs? Generally speaking, on large capital ships, no. Simply because a mast or masts large enough to provide a reasonable amount of power for moving a ship, assuming its engines have been disabled, or they've run out of fuel or whatever. Especially once you're talking ironclad warships, those masts have to be pretty large. And if the mast is very large, it also needs an awful lot of lines to make sure that it's stable and it stays up in the right place, which is obviously a lot of cable or rope. Now, if you're going to make those folding, you have a bit of a problem, because you either can make them folding as in maybe folding in half, but that isn't actually going to clear the sight lines at all, because obviously the turrets are down at the bottom. Alternatively, you could put the entire thing on a hinge at the base and let it swing down. Now, that's going to run into several problems. One, masts are footed into the ship. They're not just deck mounted. So if you introduce a pivot point, then effectively most of the anchoring that's done inside the ship by the lower part of the mast is pointless. Everything is going to depend on the strength of the locking mechanism or locking pins or whatever that you put in that hinge once the mast is up. And yeah, I wouldn't want to be the one who had to make those calculations. Let me assure you of that. Plus, the turrets, unless you're looking at something like Inflexible, tend to be on the centre line. That's the best place for them. Folding the masts down is going to fold them over the turrets, which again doesn't really help. On something like Inflexible with an echelon turrets, then in theory it might give you some benefit, because then you could in theory fire over the masts while they were down. However, you're probably still going to do a huge amount of blast damage to them. In fact, probably more, because more of them is going to be subjected to the blast effects. Plus, the mast is still going to come down across the centre line, so you still have the problem of an echelon turrets. And the fact that you're either going to have an awful lot more cabling and lines to let them down gently, plus you're going to need a massive set of motors to do it, because I don't want to think about, like looking at this HMS Sultan in the early 20th century. If that mast is on a hinge and you've got a bunch of men holding ropes, even if they are through pulleys and cranks or capstans, etc., to let it down, that's an awful lot of weight. It would not be fun. I can assure you of that. So yeah, folding masts to not encumber the firing arcs, I'm afraid it's just not going to work. About the best you could possibly do would maybe be collapsible masts, but that's still not going to clear your firing arcs. What it might do if you had a sort of HMS Devastation style front and back turreted vessel, which already has pretty good fire arcs, if you have collapsible masts amidships, then that might reduce your overall profile, the effect on stability of the top weight, and the wind resistance, but it's not going to really help you with the firing arcs all that much, unfortunately. Basically, once you get beyond the size where you could just drop the mast and stash it away, which would be a very small vessel, it's not going to work. Vokir asks, how long did it take the British battlecruisers to raise steam at the Battle of the Falkland Islands? Could von Spee simply have said, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, but presumably auf Deutsch, and then rushed the harbour entrance to catch the ships at anchor, or just as they were exiting the harbour at low speed? Sturdy is reported to have had his ships at 2 hours sailing notice, but I think the crews were either very quick off their feet or they were a little bit more prepared than just the 2 hours notice, because von Spee's ships were sighted at about 10 to 8 local time in the morning. Notice was given aboard the battle cruisers at about 10 past 8, about 20 minutes later, or thereabouts. But everybody, apart from Bristol, which had a more extensive boiler shutdown, was ready to go by about 9:45, and then they emerge from the harbour around 10 o'clock. So from the time approximately when they're actually told, right, the German ships are out there, we need to get going, to when they report we're at steam, we're ready to go, was about an hour and a half. So that's the how long it took them to raise steam. Now, it seems the leading elements of von Spee's unit were kind of southeast of Stanley, well, Port Stanley that is, by about, depending on which map you read, sometime around between 20 past 9 and 20 to 10. And this is when they were fired on by Canopus, and that's when they made the decision to pull back. Now, looking at their overall speed of advance, if they had continued to advance whilst under fire from Canopus, then in theory the faster elements of von Spee's unit could have gotten a kind of a broadside position across the entrance of Port Stanley by around about the time the British ships had steam up and were ready to move out. So rushing the ships at anchor isn't going to happen, because by the time he's then turned into the harbour and presumably is, able to navigate without smashing into some rocks or shoals or whatever, by the time he's actually entering the harbour as opposed to being just outside it, the British ships are going to be on the move as well, and that's not a circumstance that he wants to be in, quite apart from the fact, obviously, as he enters he's going to be shelled by everybody. As the British ships are exiting the harbour, yes, in theory he could have intercepted them at that point whilst British ships were powering out of the harbour. The slight problem with that is, of course, that would mean he would be willingly putting himself in a position where, okay, he would be at a shorter distance, so in theory the 8-inch shells might have some more chance of dealing some more damage to the two battlecruisers, but on the other hand he is also at much shorter distance, which means that the 12-inch guns are going to have a much, much easier time hitting him, and all the other British ships are pretty much all of them are there. So he's going to come under an absolute hail of fire, as opposed to the historical Battle of the Falkland Islands, where the British ships kind of get a little bit strung out and chasing down individual targets. And this is the thing you've got to remember, is that von Spee's ships are not all together in one unit. He's detached Gneisenau and Nuremberg to go and have a look. So it would be those two in a close-range firefight with the entirety of Sturdy's force, and probably around about the time that they're getting really badly chewed up would be when the rest of von Spee's force arrives, which is not going to be a very good situation to be in, because he's effectively feeding his force piecemeal into the teeth of an enemy with considerably more firepower than him. And the only advantage he has is that there is a certain degree of constriction of manoeuvre to the British ships, so perhaps he can hopefully get some torpedoes off or something. But if he can, then the British can do the same to him, so swings and roundabouts. How many Blackburns could a Blackburn burn if a Blackburn could burn Blackburns? I think we've found Fletcher's new identity. Asks, how long would it take on average for the navies of the Commonwealth, France, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Greece, Poland, Germany and Japan to mobilise for war in, say, early July of 1939? I don't think there is really going to be an average time, because in July 1939 people are at very different states of readiness, and the size of the navy is also going to make things very difficult. So Poland, for example, relatively small navy, more than a little suspicious of the goings-on its borders, probably can mobilise pretty darn quick in the matter of, from the word go. I mean, they're mobilising already to a certain degree, but from the stage they're in July 1939 through to full-time war readiness is going to be under a month. Japan is technically already at war, so they're technically already mobilised, albeit they're at war with China. So if you ask the Japanese fleet to turn around and go, right, it's wartime, lads, then the Japanese Navy is just going to be like, okay, where do we go? Near enough as makes no difference. They'd have to bring some ships online, but overall, bringing the Japanese Navy up to war readiness in July 1939 wouldn't be a long procedure. It might be a bit longer than the Polish Navy, because they have to reposition ships from off of the Chinese coast, and they've also got, a lot more ships and bigger ships to bring online. Those individually might take a bit longer. But say Norway, okay, it's got a small navy, but it's completely unprepared for war. I mean, they were near enough as almost unprepared for war when the Germans actually showed up, so the Norwegians take a lot longer to mobilise. France has the advantage of tension, which would have prepped it a little bit sooner, but has one of the larger navies. In fact, apart from Japan, the largest navy of all on this list, and isn't actively at war, so would take a few months to get ready for war completely. And then the others are, varying stages of, again, how close are they to being ready already, and how large is their navy, how much have they got left to mobilize once the order comes through. So unfortunately, there isn't really a realistic average because, as I said, for someone like Poland or Japan, those figures are going to be artificially low, whereas if you compared it somewhere like Norway or Sweden, their numbers would be significantly longer, and the Commonwealth, depending on the Commonwealth country, might also take quite a while. So any average is going to be pretty much the answer to none of them, just literally a mathematical average to all, which doesn't really help. John Graubard asks, if the size limitations imposed on the US Navy through World War II, the width of the Panama Canal locks, the height to pass under the Brooklyn Bridge, etc., had not existed, how would that have changed the design of fast battleships and carriers? In terms of height, that might not have changed a huge amount. I mean, obviously, I'm using Richelieu as an image here because she had to trim a little bit off of her superstructure to fit under the Brooklyn Bridge, but it's not huge. So maybe given the American obsession with long-range fire in the interwar period, maybe the superstructure would have been designed, or at least the mast would have been designed to carry things just a little bit higher. So you might have had a slightly chunkier superstructure, or a slightly stronger mast with the rangefinder, etc., stuck 2, 3, 4 meters further up. So obviously I can see further at that point. But that would be a relatively minor change. You're not going to see any kind of Fuso-style massive pagodas, I don't think. But the width of restriction, that would have changed things quite a bit, because as I pointed out quite a few times on the Drydock, and by the time that you're listening to this also on the Wednesday video, US battleships, in terms of their hull design, were a little bit constrained by that Panama Canal lock width, which, in order to fit through and for various other reasons, led to, when you look at the US fast battleships, led to all of them having variations on tapering bow, essentially flat sides, and then some kind of shaping on the stern. Whereas if you look at the previous US ships, i.e. the standards, effectively, you look at their top-down profile and compare it to the top-down profile of other contemporary vessels, you can see there's a lot more of a continuous curve going along with the hull, and the bow is a little bit fuller as well. So I suspect that without that Panama Canal limitation, whilst you may have seen still a relatively elongated bow compared to the standard class, because you would need that for high speed, as indeed you can see on Richelieu, she has a pretty extended bow. That bow may well have been somewhat fuller. The ultimate beam amidships might have been slightly greater, and you would have had a little bit more of a continuous curve hull, which, broadly speaking, would probably have given the ships slightly better hydrodynamics. So you might have ended up with either a ship that is capable of going faster for the installed power, or can maintain the target speed for less power, which would mean potentially more power available, as well, more displacement available for weaponry, although quite where you fit additional weaponry on some US fast battleships by the end of the war, I'm not entirely sure, or perhaps more protection. Now, that's not to say that US standards and other World War I battleships, etc., don't have some areas of the hull along the amidship section that aren't effectively slab-sided. It does happen, but when you look especially at photographs of overhead profiles and you compare the proportion of hull that is effectively flat on the older ships and on ships like Bismarck, Richelieu, King George V, etc., with the North Carolinas, South Dakotas and Iowas, you will notice quite a stark difference. And that, as they say, is that for this particular episode of The Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, and keep an eye out next week when hopefully we shall have more announcements about exactly when and where I'm going to be in February in relation to being in the US again. See you then.